G'day painters! Today we're back to 40k to continue work on my 1000 Suns with Ahriman. Let's get to it. Before we start, I wanted to show that I've magnetised him so I can swap him between being on foot and on disc. I'm not painting the disc today, I plan on doing so sometime in the future, probably off camera, but I thought I'd show you the magnetisation quickly here. My 1000 Suns are purple and gold rather than the traditional blue and gold. Because of this, I start them all from Diabolic Plum, which I do through my airbrush. I tried out starting from both purple and gold, and I settled on starting from purple for my army. If you want more information on why I made that decision, check out my rubrics video on my channel. The first colour I block in is Resplendent Red for his robes. This is the cloth colour I'm using for the majority of my army, and I think it goes well with the purple, gold and off-white that are my main other colours. Next, I block in his cloak. I wanted this to be a different colour to his robe to give him more character and help him pop on the table when he's mixed in with my rubrics and other sorcerers. So I settled on doing it off-white rather than introducing a new colour. As you'd expect, this took a few layers to get a nice even finish. I do wonder if starting Ahriman from purple was a mistake. There actually isn't much purple on him compared to the rubrics. Maybe I should have started him from like a neutral grey or something instead to make the lighter colours quicker to do. Something for you to consider when you're doing your own Ahriman. Normally I block all the colours in on a model before I start doing highlights and shading, but I decided to change it up while painting Ahriman, mostly because I knew I was going to be putting a fair few hours into him, and it's nice to get some wins in to help you feel like you're making progress when doing a long project. So I started highlighting his cloak, and the first step was Ancient Stone. To find the highlights, I'm holding him to the light in the same position and seeing where the light hits. This is the simplest way to get the highlights right for a cloak. It's a bit hard to see here because I use a ring light when I'm recording to give better light for you guys watching, which gives less of a directional light, but I had another lamp shining down from the top and I was able to see where that was hitting, so I could base my highlights off that. Once I had established where I wanted the highlights, I knew where the shadows should go, so I broke out Tomb King Tan to block in the shadows. I've been moving away from using washes on cloth lately. I feel like they don't really give the shadows you want for cloth. They just naturally sink into the deepest recesses, and with cloth that is like blowing in the wind, the deepest recesses aren't necessarily where you want the shadows, so I think it's worth building them up manually on models you want to take to that extra level. Then it's back to continuing to build the highlights, and the next step was bony spikes. I'm just working inside the highlights I established previously, building it up in smaller areas where the light would be focusing. I'm working with my paints pretty thin down here so I can build it up slowly and get a nicer gradient. I'm also doing some glazing back and forth with the previous colour in spots where I want to smoothen out the transition. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just take your time and do a bit of glazing to help it look that bit smoother. And then the final highlight is pale sand. I'm doing exactly what I did in the previous step, just in even smaller areas, using it nicely thinned down and just building up that highlight and transition nicely. Then doing a bit of glazing if I want to smoothen out the transition. Once I was happy with the highlights, I spent another minute or so just going back and forth with all the colours to clean up any transitions that I felt needed it. Next, it was time to work on the robe. Once again, I don't want to use a wash for the shadows, so I'm using Basilisk Red to establish them manually. I found the Robe was much easier to find the shadow spots. I just sat him on my desk and saw where the shadows were. Nice and easy. Then I start on the highlights with Angelic Red. Once again, it's pretty easy to find where I want the highlights, but just sitting him on the desk. I'm doing the same thing as I did for the cloak. I'm establishing the highlights first, then doing some glazing to smoothen out the transitions. When you're glazing like this, remember that brush direction matters. Where your brush leaves the model is where it'll deposit the most paint. So always keep that in mind and move your brush in the direction you want to be lightest if you're highlighting up or darkest if you're shading down. Next is Legendary Red for the next layer of highlights. It'll probably shock you all to learn that I worked inside the highlights I established in the previous step, just in smaller areas. Once again, using it pretty thin down and going back and forth with some glazing to give a nice smooth gradient. And to finish the highlights, it's Sacred Scarlet. You all know the drill by now. I do want to take this moment to ask that no one turn this video into a drinking game. If you drink every time I say working in smaller areas or transition, gradient, smoothing it out, I fear someone may die. So let's all agree no drinking games here. Finally, it's time for another colour. With the black, I blocked in the soft armour joints and the pipes and tubes around the model. You want to be very careful here to not mess up any of the work you've already done. That's a big reason why I often block all the colours in before doing the shading and highlighting. It's far easier to fix a mistake if it's not highlighted yet, and I find I make most of my mistakes when I'm doing the blocking in. For his trophy sash thing, not really sure what to call that, not a belt, but whatever. For that thing, his book and the pouches on his staff, I block them all in with oak brown for a dark leather. I normally like leather brown for leathers, but I feel like it blends into the warm reds too much, so I went with something a bit darker. So I wear a glove because my hands get pretty sweaty and I find they rub off the paint really easy, so gloves help protect my paintwork. But then something like this happens and makes me question it. The little dangly skull got caught in my glove and it snapped off because of it. This became an ongoing issue for me, where I glued it back on and it would break off again during the next paint session. I need to find some wire that's thin enough to let me pin it. But if you see the little piece missing during the video, you know why. Then I used Ancient Stone to block in the pages of his tome. I went back and forth on what colour I should use for this, since I'm already using this colour on his cloak, but I couldn't find one I liked for the pages as much, so just accepted that I'll be using this. I'll be using a wash on it later, which will discolour it a bit and make it look different. Finally, it was time for the dreaded gold trim. Using Retributer Armour, I carefully move around the model, blocking it all in. As you'd expect for any Thousand Suns model, this is by far the longest step. It's easy to understand why people try to find ways to skip this step or make it quicker, but I really think the only way to get the best result is to just knuckle down and paint it normally. There isn't really a shortcut that's going to make it look as good as if you take the time and paint it all properly. And since my Thousand Suns are going to be my ego army that I spend way too long painting and taking to that next level, that's what I do. Then with plate mail, I block in the metallic parts of the staff that I've not done gold. This is some sections on the shaft of the staff and the cross beam on the top of the shaft, and the chain for the dangly skull that is temporarily back on the staff. That won't last long. It'll break off soon. Next is Death Metal to block in the exhaust ports on his power pack. For all the random bone parts around the model, I picked Skeleton Bone. My plan for this is to hit it with a pretty heavy shade later, which is going to change the colour of them enough that it'll look pretty different to the cloak. Though looking back at it, I think I should have started from Tomb King's Tan instead. Starting darker than hitting it with a heavy shade would give an even bigger difference between the bones and the cloak. Speaking of the wash, that was my next step. With Strong Tone, I hit all the bone parts I did in the previous step with a pretty heavy wash. As you can see, it's giving them a pretty different look to the cloak, and they don't blend together too much. This is a step where I genuinely questioned if it was the wrong choice while I was painting it. On the art, Ahriman has his headdress and the parts on his staff as one colour, but I thought doing the stripes would help him fit into my army better and just generally give a better look. Which in the end I think it does, but it was towards the end of the night, I was tired, and about 20 minutes into doing the stripes I almost changed my mind and painted it all the same colour. I'm happy I stuck it out though and think it was worth it in the end. It's really one of those decisions you'll have to make for yourself. Follow the box art and save yourself 40 minutes, or put the extra time in and do them. There really is no wrong answer. This is the step where I glued him together, which was a mistake for one reason, which we'll cover in a minute. I'm curious if any of you can spot the reason though. If you have spotted it, why not let me know in the comments. The reason I decided to glue him together here was because I was done for the night and I thought I was at a point where he was ready to go together. I should have waited till the next day and looked at him with fresh, not tired eyes, but that's a lesson to be learned, which I probably won't learn and will do again in the future. He is starting to look cool though. And this part right here is why I should have waited. The magic flame smoky thing trailing from his hand. Everything else is fine, but this was awkward to paint with him together and would have been much easier if I did it while he was still sub-assembled. So if you're following along at home, finish this part before gluing him together. Next I started highlighting the bones. And yeah, I'm jumping around randomly a lot while painting this guy. I don't really know why I did, and I'm sure it makes it harder to follow along with, so sorry about that. I wanted the highlight jumps to be big for the bones to once again help them read differently to the cloak, so I used Ancient Stone as the first highlight colour. Then to finish off the highlights on the bones I used Pale Sand, which is another decent jump to continue the previous step. While I had Pale Sand out, I also did the highlights on the stripes on his headdress and staff. And while I do that, it's time for a sub plug. If you're enjoying the video, why not give it a like? And if you like the content I'm putting out, hit that subscribe button to see more from me. Every like and subscriber matters to a small channel like mine, and I do really appreciate the support. Time for some shading. I started with purple tone for all the purple parts. I also do an all over wash with this on the stripe parts on the headdress and staff. Pushing it into the recesses helps define the lines and hide any brush control errors I may have had and haven't fixed yet. It really does help give them a cleaner look. The next shade I did was soft tone for an all over wash for the gold. I also did a wash of this on the pages of the book. This wash is to set my lighter shadows and give some nice definition to the textured and detailed parts of the gold. I like it for this, but it's not dark enough for my darkest shadows. So the next step is using strong tone to build shadows in specific spots where I want some darker shadows. I think this step really helps the gold pop, and it's worth doing. It only takes a couple of minutes and adds a surprising amount of depth to the model. While I wait for those shades to dry, I do the highlights on the leather. With fur brown, I do some edge highlights and some small scratchy highlights to add a bit of the texture you'd expect from leather. I don't do too much because I feel like Ahriman would keep his gear in top condition. Next, I block the eyes in white. I messed up with my brush control a little bit here, which is why this step is a bit longer than you'd expect. I just added the time to clean up the mistake into this step too. Then with Warp Lightning Contrast, I blocked in the eyes. This is a really nice and simple way to do glowing eyes for marines and that sort of thing. You could stop here and not add any further highlights if you wanted to, but I do a dot later, which I'll cover when I get to that next step. The last shade for this model is Dark Tone for the silver parts. I didn't do this with the rest of the washes because I wanted them to dry first so they wouldn't run together. It probably wouldn't have been a big deal, but it's better to be safe and I could work on other things while I gave them time to dry properly. Back to the flamey, smoky, magicy thing. With Rainforest, I left yellow in the deepest recesses and the spots closest to his hand. As I got further away from his hand, I left less and less yellow, showing that the hand is where the power is coming from and concentrated. I also used Rainforest to do a dot on the eyes to finish them off, but you can skip that if you're happy with them as they are. Then with Greenskin, I repeated the previous step, leaving more Rainforest and yellow closer to the hand and less as I got further away. I did a fair bit of glazing here to help smoothen out the transitions too. It's a pretty big jump in colour, so you want to smooth them out. I do need to get more greens for my collection. The three I'm using here I think are the only three I have from the Fanatic range. I really need to add some more. Then with Angel Green, I again repeated the process. I did a lot of glazing back and forth with all four colours till I was okay with how it was looking. I'm not 100% happy with this and I might revisit it in the future if I can think of something that'll take it to the next level. If you have any suggestions for what would help make it pop, why not drop a comment below. Then with Necromancer Cloak, I blocked in the gems and did the final step on the magic flamey thing. Unfortunately, my camera froze and I didn't notice, so I don't have the footage of doing it on the magic, but you'll be able to see it in the future steps and during the reveal at the end. Ahriman has a lot of gems around him, so make sure you take your time and find them all. I'm doing teal gems for my Thousand Suns, so I broke out Pharaoh Guard and blocked in the bottom 2/3 of the gems. If you're not sure which direction should be the bottom, just sit him on your desk and see which way he's facing up. This is mostly important for the staff as that's angled and the gem's on a bit of a weird angle. Then with Aqua Alchemy, I blocked in the bottom third of the gems. Looking back, I wonder if I should have done a couple of different coloured gems on Ahriman. He has far more gems than the rubrics I've painted previously, and it could have been a good way to add in another splash of colour to the model. But then I lose the consistency of all the gems in my army being teal. Something for me to think about, I guess. Then with white, it's a tiny dot on the very top of the gem, the spot where the light would be coming into the gem. Then a slightly bigger dot at the bottom of the gem, the spot where the light would be exiting the gem. We're this far in and I've done no work on the purple that is the main colour of my army. Probably time to fix that. So I break out Magecast Magenta to start the highlights. Once again, if you're struggling to work out where the highlights should be placed, just stand him on your desk. Ahriman is a pretty detailed model, but his stance makes it pretty easy to pick out where the highlights should be. Warlock Magenta is the next step for the highlights. Shockingly, I'm working within the same areas as the previous step, just in smaller areas. This is also the last highlight I do for spots that aren't in the brightest light. As always, if you're not happy with a jump of colours, spend some time doing some glazing to smoothen it out. Then for the final highlights, only on the spots that the light would be catching the most, is Spellbound Fuchsia. I realised for Ahriman it's actually most of his purple parts. The legs and lower body, which you normally wouldn't do in this step, are all covered by his robes. Finally, it's time to highlight the golds. Starting with bright gold, I work around the model picking out the raised parts and the parts facing upwards that the light would be hitting. Nothing fancy here, we all know the process by now. Then, with Mithril, I do the highlights on the silver, and I also use this for edge highlights for the gold, only on the spots that would be reflecting the most light. So, after I started editing this video and I'd taken the photos and filmed the reveal, I noticed that I'd missed this stupid little feather, so I had to go back and paint it. I blocked it in with crystal blue. Then with bright sapphire, I did the texture, putting a line down the middle of the feather and the lines going out to give the feather that feathery look that we're all familiar with. And he's finished. I'm sure some of you are thinking 7 hours is way too long for this, but it's less than double the time I spent on my rubrics per model, and I think individual characters, especially named characters, are well worth double the time of your standard rank and file models. You also need to put a lot of time into your models if you want to take them to the next step up. I could easily spend another 7 or even 14 hours on him to take him even further, but as much as my Thousand Suns are meant to be my ego army, it's still an army that I want to get painted and on the table within a reasonable time frame. I think one of the greatest things about our hobby is that we each get to decide how much time we're willing to commit to an army or an individual model, and we'll get results that are in line with that time. It's also worth remembering that if you're putting less than like an hour into a model, to not be disheartened if you don't get the same results as someone like Ninjon or Squidmar. They're putting more time into their models than even I am, and the end product they put out really shows it. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video and it helps you in your painting projects. If you have enjoyed it, then why not give the video a like, and subscribe to see more content from me. Catch you in the next video.